Hello, everyone. We just want to thank you so very much for tuning in to our panel discussion. Today, we will be discussing the problematic use of the word riot, historically and contemporarily. We have several brilliant, incredible guests. I can't wait for you to hear from them. But we just want to say that on our page, we're trying to do corrective work. We're trying to do uplifting work for our community. The 1970 Augusta Riot occurred 51 years ago this May, and we're still having to present history accurately. And in light of recent historical events in our nation, we definitely wanted to discuss the term riot and why our committee decided to use it under our official banner. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests for this panel discussion. Mr. Shawn Edwards is Executive Director of the Augusta, Georgia Land Bank Authority. He is a brilliant community activist and a charismatic speaker. He's a leader in the 1970 Augusta Riot Observance Committee. Dr. John Hayes is an associate professor of history at Augusta University, and he is the author of Hard Heart Religion, Interracial Faith in the Poor South. He is also a leader on the 1970 Augusta Riot Observance Committee. Also joining us is Dr. Elizabeth Hinton. She's an associate professor of history and African American studies at Yale University, with secondary appointment as professor of law at Yale Law School. She's an author, and most recently, there's a book that's going to come out this May. It's called America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. We're very eager to read it when it comes out. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Ken Macon. He's a journalist based in North Augusta, South Carolina. And beginning in 2015, he has crafted the Making a Difference podcast. He offers sharp analysis of contemporary events, especially on the politics of race. And he's a frequent contributor to the Christian Science Monitor. And I will be moderating. My name is Nefertiti, and I am just so excited. Our first question for our discussion is, who originated the use of the term riot as it relates to Black uprisings, and how has this term been used historically?
Should I take this question? Okay, so it wasn't until the mid-1960s, really beginning with Harlem in 1964, when the term riot became associated with moments of mass collective violence in Black communities. Before that, throughout most of the 20th century, most of the rioting in American cities involved white vigilante or white supremacist mob violence. Beginning in Wilmington in 1898, and then Springfield in 1908, East St. Louis in 1917, the Red Summer of 1919, Tulsa in 1921, which many people have heard about. And essentially, these riots were rooted in white people's resentment of Black gains and employment, and their resistance to integration. And really, these were examples of white mobs coming into Black communities, as in Greenwood and Tulsa, which many refer to as the Black Wall Street, a thriving Black community, and terrorizing residents, killing people indiscriminately. In some instances, like in Chicago in 1919 and Washington, D.C., white and Black residents engaged in kind of race wars. And these incidents were usually labeled race riots, even though they were most often perpetuated and instigated by white mobs. And it wasn't until the 1960s when collective Black violence emerged in response to oppressive and repressed and discriminatory and repressive institutions, that these incidents of violence became, termed as riots and associated with Black people and criminality.
Thank you so much. In light of what you just shared, in your assessment, is the term race riot accurate or appropriate? I do hear that term used as well in contemporary settings.
So I think when people refer to the violence of the 1960s as a race riot, they're saying that in part to signal, to use a code word to signal that they involve Black people or people of color. We also see the term used, as I mentioned, in describing white violence, and there's a kind of, in that term too, it obscures the fact that, that white people were really the instigators of this violence, and it implies that, there's kind of an equal race war going on. So both uses of the term obscure the larger power relations at work, because of course, in the instances of the white rioting, this is in defense of white supremacy. It's in response to a perception of Black gains or encroachment and Black mobility. And in the case of the 1960s and the so-called Black riots or race riots, these incidents are rooted in many of the same grievances as the mainstream civil rights movement. They are fundamentally about employment, equal education, decent housing, political representation, and an end to police brutality. And most often in the 1960s, these incidents, as in Augusta, were sparked by some kind of incident of either police contact or police brutality. So, the circumstances through which they begin are in entirely different terms. So, that alone, I think, should urge us to think about how, when we use the term riot, the power relations and the context and the history that, leads to the violence ends up getting hidden in a way.
Yeah, can I piggyback on something Elizabeth said regarding race riots? Now, white society is not associated with race. It's immune from it. So when you speak to race, be it you say BIPOC, people of color, minority, whatever terminology you use, you mean some group other than white people. You don't have white on white crime, you only have black on black crime. So being immune from an association or an attachment to race, when you say race riot, you're speaking to the individuals who are in the street using dog whistle language. And it automatically gives the media the cover that it needs in order to depict that group a particular way so that you can steer away from the issue. Typically, you don't have black folks in the street destroying property, making a demand of a local, state, or federal government from a position of some emotional hurt. It's from a position of seeking justice, typically from an injustice that has already been served. So you want punishment for a cop who killed someone, or you want to make a stand against a particular law that you believe that is unjust to a specific community. But it doesn't come from a place of an emotional hurt or some type of belief that you're being subjected to something that isn't real. It comes from a place of an injustice having been served and therefore justice needing to be served. But when you can put race on it, then you can steer away from the demand of the people in the street and you can just look at the people in the street. So until white gets associated, or white action, let me use that, until white action gets associated with white people and not just Americanism, then race riot, and now even the term riot, will always be a racialized term. that will automatically skew those media positions.
So that's a brilliant point. And Ken, if you're able to speak towards just that aspect of how the word is used and racialized in the media, from based on your observations and experiences, can you unpack that a little for us?
Sure. I actually don't know if I could show it here with the camera, but I brought a prop. And I want to show, I don't know if you guys will be able to see it, but there's a cartoon here. Basically, it says, "When is protest dissent for a riot?" I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it's a political cartoon from 1968. And you can kind of see where on the left side, it's presumably dissent, and it's a white mob. And then on the right, you have must have law and order, and it's a black mob. So, and I think in that political cartoon, you kind of see the nature of, what we're dealing with when, when we mention the terminology of a riot, and that language is such a powerful tool, and there's so much that is tied into it in terms of, when you hear words, how words are shaped, and the media obviously has a huge influence with that. I think even when we look at just the nature of what happened in Augusta in 1970, it's like the question you have to ask is who told the story, or what media outlet told the story, and that is, for the most part, a singular entity. And so you have to unpack, what's the political perspective or the political ideologies of that entity. What's the role of Black media? What was the role of Black media if there was a media present in 1970? And looking at those, the media that's there and the media that's not there, how it shapes the destiny of not just the word, but how people feel about what happened in general, and how, this was 51 years ago, and there's still people in Augusta. If you ask 100 people in Augusta, how many people can tell you, the history of what happened? And yet this is an event that happened that dramatically changed the Deep South. And as we look at just some of the, we can say the riots of the 1960s, but we also, those of us who understand the effect that Dr. King's assassination had, throughout the country, the immediate riots that happened after his assassination, but also in the years to follow. Just having a general understanding of all of that, you kind of see how, some of this frustration bubbled up and bubbled over. And I know that's kind of going away from just the problematic use of the word, but I think it's just people to understand. It's important for people to understand like where that angst is coming from. A lot of what happens, I think, in these conversations is that it's not in this conversation, I'm just saying the conversation in general, is that it's easy to dismiss the feelings and thoughts of people, through a singular word. You say, oh, well, they're just rioters. You don't look at the attitudes and the emotions and what Dr. Hinton and Brother Edwards have already alluded to. Some of the previous injustices that yielded the response, the emotional and passionate response from folks. And so those are things I think we need to look at as we continue to have these type of discussions.
Thank you so much for your insight on that. So a lot of times, public discourse and the way that we use words in the community can be, language can take on a life of its own, right? And we've discussed how the media has used the term historically. One thing that I would like to hear from you all about is Dr. Hayes. So I took your U.S. history course last semester, and we discussed, the beginning, the foundation of our country, and the major events for the first 150 years. When we discussed the Boston Tea Party, we called it that We didn't call it a riot because everyone knows it by the Boston Tea Party. But you definitely challenged the way that we discuss and frame these historical events. So everyone, in light of your vocation, if you're in academia, if you do work in the community, if you're a journalist, can you tell me what you think could be done to address how the word is used within your sphere?
I'll start if that's okay with the group. I just being a journalist, and a lot of what I experience is that, again, people just don't know the history, and so I think it's just incumbent upon us in the media to be more responsible in terms of informing people. And I think what happens in terms of where there's a collective failure in media is that I think there's more of a focus on entertainment as opposed to information. And so once we get back to wanting to inform folks, then you get some of the nuance that's required. You know, when we talk about, just even the terminology that's used, and not just words like riot, but I think there are just certain buzzwords that, denote certain things. You may use, you may hear the word thug or just terms like that really set people off. But and I'll just say likewise, I think one of the important things that we're seeing here in this discussion is that the word diversity, I think, is overused, but it's underapplied. And I can say just in newsrooms that statistically, there's a lack of representation when it comes to African Americans in the newsroom. I've experienced it. I've worked in newsrooms for many years. I can tell you all, I've worked in newsrooms, I'll say, for the better part of 10 years. And I can count on these fingers right here how many people I came across who looked like me in newsrooms. So that is part of it. There's got to be, like I said, an influx of that, not just, like I said, diversity in terms of, when we say representation, but I just think a diversity of thought, I think, will help kind of bring some revelation to this topic.
I guess just picking up on when Ken was talking about like the use of the word thug, I think that so many of these terms, especially as they are applied to people of color and Black people in particular, are criminalizing, are deeply criminalizing. And that's, that's part of my issue with the use of the term riot in general, in academia, by scholars and in other spaces as well, because when Lyndon Johnson started, responded to Harlem in '64 and said, this is a riot and this has nothing to do with civil rights protests, and these people are criminals. I'm, using the language that Johnson used, and they're hoodlums and they're troublemakers. This renders this action, which again is, in response to state-sanctioned violence and really the outgrowth of discrimination and oppression over generations, and a call and a demand to be included as full citizens in American society. That's what these incidents are really about. And so when they're criminalized and then they're seen as something meaningless and devoid of political, any kind of political intent or motivation, then this automatically prevents us from having a response that that is outside of the police. So, when we call kids thugs instead of, somebody who might need extra help for whatever reason, if somebody's a thug, then the way to respond is to arrest them and remove them from the community. If somebody is a rioter and a criminal, then they deserve to be in jail. But if somebody is a protester, or if somebody, needs help or needs extra resources, then we can think about different ways to respond to them. And so I think that's a big problem with the term. And academics have been, instrumental, academics and journalists, I think have in many ways worked together to create narratives, to kind of own language, to determine what is acceptable and what isn't. and many people fall in line. So I think that's one of the things that I'm really trying to do in my research is to, push back against that and encourage us to view these incidents of political violence, because the violence is political. What happened in Augusta in 1970 was political, as a rebellion, as an uprising, so that we might be able to come to terms with the demands that went into the actions of the participants, and so that we might be able to envision a response outside of more law enforcement. Because, for the past 51 years in Augusta, more than 50 years, the response to inequality and poverty has been, more policing, more surveillance, and more incarceration, which, as we know, it only continues to fuel these cycles of unrest. Even if they go away for decades, they're still bubbling under the surface. So I really think that, using different sets of language can help us imagine a different, and helps us come to terms with the past in a full way, so that we can imagine a different kind of future and not repeat the mistakes of the past, which have been unable to address the root causes of the violence in the first place.
I want to piggyback off of that, Shawn. I don't mean to cut in, but just something came to mind. Our local transit service actually is they're installing a mask mandate, and one of the ways that they're installing the mask mandate is they're saying that if someone's not wearing a mask on the bus, that they could call the local authorities. And my first thought at hearing that is, why? For what? Like, all of the places that we're seeing people not wear their mask, and we're seeing these very soft, if mandates at all. We understand that someone who's riding the bus presumably may not have any other form of transportation. So why attack those individuals, and why police those individuals in that way? But what has to happen is that when we hear about these things, when we see about these things, and I'm just speaking for journalists, is that there has to be a level of courage. There has to be some type of pushback to say, look, this isn't right. And sometimes you may speak these things out loud, and you may get a response from a society and from a community that looks down on the poor. And so you have to reiterate and be that voice. And just the word there is courage. And I think that's what Dr. Hinton is speaking to as well, is sometimes you're that voice in the wilderness. But if that's what it takes to shift the conversation in another direction. I think we're seeing that in this country, is that, however you may feel about Democrat or Republican, like, the shift is decidedly moving to the right. Everything's to the right. And there's got to be a pushback in the other direction. I'm saying, like, functionally, ideologically. But in order for that to happen, you got to push back against a force that's clearly heading in one direction.
John, I'm gonna go after you, sir.
Okay. I was just going to say, with just briefly, with the discipline of history, I think two things that I've thought for several years are just important in the discipline are precision and context. And so I think sometimes, like, thinking very, very hard about how you even frame something in a single sentence or phrase. Because once something's sort of framed, that gets you off on a whole, there's so many associations to it. And so I think sort of playing around with language some before you publicize it, and being sure that you're trying to do justice to the events themselves. Obviously with our work, we went over and over, short phrases, hours and hours of discussion, trying to make sure that it could not be taken in a way that co-opted what we were trying to say. And then I think with context, any historians, like, anything has meaning, things only have meaning in context. So if you say, fight like hell, depending on what context, there's certain meanings of that. Mm-hmm. And so, like, with Augusta or other things called riots, tens of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people, they don't just start destroying stuff. That just does not happen. Like, human beings don't do that. Most of us are relatively, kind of creatures of habit. That never just happens. There's always a story behind it. And often uncovering that story is actually very difficult, because the sources that do exist wanted to frame it as this just exploded out of nowhere. We had no idea where this came from. It must just be that these people are kind of violence prone, and we're just looking for an excuse to get violent. And so context helps you, uncover. This was the culmination of months and months and months of struggle against injustice that finally took this form. How long does the injustice go back? I mean, decades and decades, and et cetera. So anyway, that's precision and context are my two things.
I want to go back to the original way in which Nefertiti kind of put the question out, how we frame discussion around historical events depending upon the groups of individuals involved in those events. So the Boston Tea Party is a part of our American history, and it was the media, as Kim pointed out, present at the time, that helped to structure how that story was spread, because individuals had to rely upon media sources in order to find out what took place in this other part of the country that social media now gives us the opportunity to find out about instantaneously. So an important thing that's missing when it comes to Black empowerment, which that's all these activities in each of these cities is the desire for the realization of our full citizenship. And so we don't have the two sides of that media platform that are necessary. We are not present in white media in an impactful way in order to change the discussion to give validity to our position. The token may be there who represents the Black voice to amen whatever is coming out, but not a serious pushback. We're not in those major media discussions representing this group of people, not a flattened Blackness, but this specific group of people's individual exact struggle. And on the adverse of that, we don't control enough of our own media platforms with large level of influence. So we may have individuals that are telling a very honest, concrete story, both Black and white, going back to the research that John referenced and the specificity that we wanted to put to each one of our small statements, let alone the overall story. But we don't have the budget, we don't have the radio wave, we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have those things to say, this is the way in which that story needs to be depicted, and drown out the other microphones. So it's a difficult thing when media, each medium is designed to give one perspective, and that is truly that white is right in all things. So even when whites act out January 6th, there has to be some form of cover given. That's at the top. And President Biden is saying, don't you call them protesters, you call them rioters, but also saying that that's not everyone who behaves that way. Everyone in that group on that day behaved that way. And they don't get proxy designation the way that we do. Because every one of my people ain't Nuck Nuck or Cory Booker's best friend, Nick Bone, whoever he made up when he was running for president. Every one of my people isn't that individual either. But that's who the police see when they stop us. But that's not who the Capitol Police saw as they barged in. So it's just a difficult thing when you talk about terminology, when you don't get to control how the message is delivered to the masses. And so this conversation is an important one. Everyone's individual work is important, because as we grow, the ability to be able to get information out and control our messaging is going to force individuals to ask hard questions. And I really think that's all we're trying to get to. That when you ask the hard question of would those individuals, whether it's a Black Lives Matter protest, been treated the same way, it forces a president to say, no, it would be different. We got to have enough influence through our continued work, though, to demand the hard questions to be answered. And then I think we have to inevitably get to that second level, that after the hard question is answered, now what do we do about that hard answer?
Thank you so very much. I can't help but lead us to the next question. So our committee, decided to go with the name 1970 Augusta Riot. And we are an interracial committee. We're also intergenerational. So there are a multitude of views and emotions and perspectives on our own project, even. If you don't mind, Shawn and Dr. Hayes, if you could just share a bit of what we went through in our conversations on what word to use, because there were several that came up in discussion.
John, you want to kick off, or would you like me to start?
You can start, Shawn.
I'll move a tad bit closer. I would say that everyone wanted to be their fullest selves when it came to the terminology we were going to use to represent this movement. And we were allowed a safe space to be able to be our full selves. So that was new for me, and it was also celebrated. So I appreciated the dialogue and the length of time that we invested in landing where we did. But part of the push from my position was to use the term riot, and it spoke to the passion fight for freedom, as opposed to something that was a little more subdued. Um, Race riots, of course, we steered away from that one, but riots in and of themselves represent a level of natural conflict and push as a last resort. It can be labeled as desperation. It can also be labeled as courageous. It's when you put it all on the line. Those individuals who stormed the Capitol last month didn't have an issue being called rioters because they thought the reason that they needed to take over the Capitol, and that's some of their words, take over the Capitol, was righteous. And so I'm not mad at the man who fights for righteousness. It's just that righteousness can be interpreted different ways. To John's point from the earlier question, it's context, right? So I may stand on the opposite side of you in the war and feel just as righteous when I throw my spear when you threw yours at me. It's necessary that you have those levels of conflict amongst groups when fighting for limited resources, because that's all society is doing in this capitalistic system we have, or a communist system that someone else may practice. You know, there's only so much land, there's only so much food, there's only so much clean water, there's only so much space. There are only so many positions of control, and there are only so many levers to pull once you get in control. And when you are an oppressed people, and that's what my people are here, when you are an oppressed people, you are denied access to those things that you need. And so you deal with things like high blood pressure and diabetes, trying to combat the stress of this post-traumatic slave disorder while existing in a low-income environment where individuals can be pointed out to be elevated out. So rural is poor, just like ghetto is poor. So rural is white and will get funding, and ghetto will not. Again, going back to the use of terminology in this media depiction, I felt like riot was necessary because it represented the level of frustration and stress and depth that I have to suppress just to be able to do my job. It is the face behind the mask that I have to wear just to exist in society. It's all of that pressure that's on the pipes that I have to constantly keep rewrapping to keep from bursting, because I'm supposed to be a functioning member of society despite how I'm treated by that society. I'm expected to contribute to it in a positive way, not just conversations and platforms like this, but in my everyday interaction, both job, church, family, children's education. I'm not supposed to be the chip on the shoulder, but the chip on the shoulder is the weight that requires the word riot, because it's everything that you're not being given access to. It's everything you're being denied. And it's the constant reminder that it's something your people have sacrificed enough for that you shouldn't even still have to ask for it. I shouldn't even have to be in the street. The 13th Amendment is old. The 14th Amendment is old. The 15th Amendment is old. And I can't even use them the way that other communities currently use them to fight for my rights, because somebody stood in front of the Supreme Court one day and was told that they have no rights that a white man is supposed to respect. That's why it's a riot, because you're telling me I don't deserve to eat and I made the food. You're telling me I don't deserve to be under the roof and I built the house. So we burned down the house. At the end of the day, we will all be comfortable, or we will all be equally uncomfortable.
And the discussion, our internal discussion was uncomfortable and intense and stretched out over many months. Again, trying to experiment with different words before we truly went public. Protest was one we used for a while, and that seemed too muted to convey the severity of the event, the severity of the injustice that prompted the event. Rebellion seemed, I was very taken by Mr. Wilbert Allen, he was the organizer of Augusta's chapter of the Black Panther Party, and a key figure in the intensity of May 11th and 12th. We did an oral history with him in fall of 2019, and he said very insistently several times, it wasn't a riot, it was a rebellion. And I think, again, I was very taken by that and sort of pushing the group for using the term rebellion. I think that it certainly didn't come out of nowhere. There's a long story leading up to it, but it was, I don't know, rebellion, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say, Dr. Hinton. Rebellion, to me, conveys some sort of planning with a strategy of okay, this is where we go after the initial, attacks. And certainly for Mr. Allen and for some of the Payne College militants, they were planning that, wanted to see that. But for most of the people that joined in, it was kind of more sort of spontaneous. Spontaneous is not the right word, but it was not a long-term plan. Anyway, that got jumbled. But ultimately it was felt that in a community that has not wanted to talk about this, people do know it as a riot, like it or not. So if we're going to start recovering conversations about it, the actual history of it, that's a point in, and that riot conveys the severity in a way that other words simply don't.
Well, I just, listening to Shawn talk, I agree with everything that you just said. It's just that I use a different terminology, rebellion, and it's really, it's interesting too, because I use it because in my view, I feel like that term captures all of the, the desperation, the conditions, the intensity behind the incidents, in a way. So that it was interesting to hear you say that. Yeah, I think the fact, I think part of it for me is that so many people who participated in these events, pushed back against the terminology of riot. I grew up in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and many Detroiters refer to the violence of '67 as the Detroit Rebellion, similar to the Black Panther Party member. And while it's true that that there wasn't like a coordinated plan, that there wasn't some conspiracy, I think that given, so if we think about these incidents as part of a moment in U.S. history that Augusta was a part of, and that Augusta is actually one of the more severe examples of violence and more widespread. I think it's many have called it the largest riot or rebellion or uprising or civil disorder, whatever you want, in the South during this period. When we look at all this, and we know that 2,000, between the mid '60s and the mid '70s, at least 2,000 separate communities engaged in this kind of political violence, then I think that, and that so much of it followed a very clear pattern. Even within the incidents themselves, the ways in which rock throwing, a group of kids throwing rocks at police, that eventually escalates into burning and looting and violence and attacks on white people that happen in many different cities, and that police force in every single one of these incidents, the police response itself was violent and escalated the violence. We can really begin to see this moment, this in the late 60s or in the 60s and 70s as a moment of protracted violence, as a politics that that Black communities across the country, in cities big and small, in rural areas and urban areas, all engaged. So that it wasn't, it's not like it was just like one outburst. So it's not like it was just a summer of outbursts in '67. This is really, this ends up becoming the next stage of civil rights protests when, decades of nonviolent direct action movements did not successfully achieve many of their goals. And, and the inequality was still rampant. Jim Crow had formally ended and Black people had the right to vote, but people were still in poverty. Schools were still under-resourced. People were still underemployed and unemployed. And after, decades of nonviolent protests, and especially in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, the main proponent of that branch of civil rights protests, many felt like they had no other options. And I think that Shawn's comment really captures this, but to use violence in order to get their demands heard. And so, there was no planning. We don't have, in most instances, manifestos from the people who participated, even though police and the FBI, often said that that these incidents were caused by outside agitators or communists. Again, this prevents these law enforcement authorities from dealing with the fact that, no, these were community movements in response to conditions in the community and being treated like second-class citizens and being systematically excluded from access to political and economic resources. So, that is in part, that plus everything that Shawn said is why I really see these as rebellions. And again, part of that for me is, I think it's important that people, as much as we're pushing back and we're talking about terminology, it's important that people create their, label things and understand things on their own terms. I don't think it's up to anybody else to impose, how any historical moment should be seen by the community itself. But I do think that, in labeling the way in which that word has been used in the American popular imagination by journalists and by scholars, it has really removed, the kind of underlying socioeconomic context, and again, made it something that is criminal, rather than, something that is rooted fundamentally in a desire for social change and transformation, and that is challenging racial hierarchies and white supremacy.
Thank you so much for being willing to address this. It is something that I actually took a different perspective on from both of the panel members, well, committee members who are present with us on the panel. I was advocating for the word uprising because I am well acquainted with the shame that people feel about what happened here. And I know that there were victims who were slandered during that time and still slandered now because the truth is still, we're still fighting to get the truth out there. And we've already discussed, how we are criminalized. So my perspective was more so based on vindication and fighting for our dignity as human beings, being seen as for letting our humanity be acknowledged. So I'm really grateful that we were able to address that here, just in case there were community members who were curious about it, and as we are discussing the problematic use of the term. So thanks for addressing that. In closing, I wanted to ask, how common are riots in American history, and are they inherently political?
Well, so piggybacking on Dr. Hinton's statement about, because it's not semantics, rebellion versus uprising versus riot. And of course, I associate the 1970 events with a particular feeling. And that feeling may have been existent in a lot of uprisings, but when you use that socioeconomic push as the pretext for discussion to give parameters to how you define the term, almost any of them work. And so then if you use that as your context, it puts you in a position where you can say, yes, there have been thousands of those, from the fight for freedom on the plantation to get free, all the way through to the demonstration. Not that I agree with the position, but the demonstration on January the 6th. In each of those instances, you had a group that felt as if it was dealing with some degree of oppression, be it they crazy or not, right or not, justified or not, and were willing to put something on the line, some definition of freedom, incarceration, or their lives, in order to fight against a system that they felt was oppressive. Now, I don't believe that each group is justified in its position. So I'm not trying to say that I'm condoning January 6th, but I do use it as a point of comparison. In each of those, you had someone saying that what's being taken from me or denied to me will no longer be allowed. So if you use just that very simplistic level of definition, there have been thousands of these, whatever you call them. But I think that it's important to say that there is a distinction, not just to that group, but go back to your Boston Tea Party question. Who's in power? Who's in the street? And what are the ones in the street demanding of those in power? So if those in power look like the people in the street, and what's being demanded is not a change of system, just a change of position, is that the same as a group being in the street that's different than those in power demanding a change in the system? I like the terminology or the metaphor about the pie. If all you want to do is change hands of who gets to cut the pie, and what I'm asking for is a slice, no matter what you call what I'm doing, and no matter what I call what you're doing, they're different. You want to change control. I want to ensure equity. And so my fight is a fight for a piece of what everyone is already about to get, and your fight is for deciding who gets what. So, I mean, to your question, I say, yeah, there have been thousands of these riot rebellions uprising from different positions. And we're going to always look back from our individual state and decide which ones we align ourselves with. I'm going to always align myself with the people who are oppressed, because I am one of an oppressed people. And I'm going to always stand with people who are fighting for freedom.
Nefertiti, could you repeat the question?
Of course. Are riots a common occurrence in American history?
The short answer is yes. I mean, we're a country built on violence. I don't, American Revolution, and you just go all the way through. I mean, when you look at, slavery, violence, poverty, violence. To bring this close to home and to, bring it to a close in some ways. I'm in North Augusta, and I've been fighting for the last 3 years to get a white supremacist monument taken down. And it's a monument that celebrates the Hamburg Massacre. And the fact that after 3 years and, of petitioning and bringing this, to the forefront on a national stage, I've heard from the AP, I've heard from CNN, to have all these entities come around and to still have the end result be that monument is still standing. Like, it's not what does it say, it's what it says about not just North Augusta, what it says about America. When you think about Aiken County, a county that was founded in part by 3 African-American men, to include Prince Rivers. And so Prince Rivers was a part of the Black Congress of 1868. And so when you look at what happened between 1868 and make sure I do this right, 1889 when he died. And so you look at what happened with the Hamburg Massacre in 1876. That man went from being at the height of, you know, his professional and political career to basically to dying penniless. You know, what we've seen is happening here. It's just reflective of the country, and you know, to quote the kids, like, this country chooses violence.
I don't think I can add anything to the brilliance that that Ken and Shawn have just shared. This is you know, as Ken said, we are a violent country, and as he also, you know, mentioned, we have bred violent conditions, and you know, the direction of the violence and the power relations behind the violence matters, as Shawn indicated.
I think I would just add one thing to your question, and that, yeah, the short answer is obviously yes, as noted. And I think that, yes, I think riots are always inherently political. They're political acts that the people rioting feel a sense of injustice. And I think that, you know, there's a phrase, you know, doing history is like, you know, history on a moving train, where it's like the present's always becoming the past. And so you're always sort of taking stock of that and trying to rightly, like, come to terms with the past. And so just like sort of as a historian, but also as a citizen, you know, seeing the term used this past summer, it had such echoes of 1970, seeing it used by white media, white political leaders, such echoes of 1970, where the attempt was to delegitimize the nature of the protest and erase the context behind it. I think, you know, one thing that January 6th does, no one would deny that there was political intent there, and it's impossible to miss. And I think that, you know, again, we're now a month out from that, doing history, you know, that may heighten our sense that riots are political. I don't know, but as used in the 60s, and I think last summer, it was to erase politics from it. But yes, I think they're inherently political.
Thank you so much. Huge thanks to all of our panelists today. We truly hope that you have enjoyed our discussion, Facebook community, YouTube community. We want you to go visit www.1970augustariot.com for more information and to stay updated on our future events. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be part of this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Likewise.